The plea had been gone for 6 hours, and in those 6 hours, the second moon had moved the wrong way. Orrin Vask stood at the window of the colony record house and watched little Sol, the smaller of the two moons over Teller's Reach, smear itself sideways across the early sky. It did not set, it did not rise, it stretched, like a drop of pale paint pulled by a thumb, until it was a long gray streak above the wheat. A moon was not supposed to do that. A moon was supposed to be a thing you could count on, the way you counted on the number 9 being larger than the number 8. For 41 years, Orrin had counted on such things. This was the third day he could not. He looked down at the back of his left hand. There, in his own neat dark ink, was a single word: Orrin. He had written it that morning, the way he had written it every morning for 3 days now, because 3 days ago, a man named Joss Tamblyn had walked into the record house and asked Orrin who he was, and then asked again, and then begun to cry, because he could not remember either. So Orrin wrote his own name on his hand each dawn, before anything else, before the kettle, before the window. It was the first record he kept now. It was the most important one. Teller's Reach was a farming world. That was the whole of it. 19,000 people lived in the one town, and the rings of fields around it, and they grew long-stalk grain, and a hard sweet root that shipped well, and they were proud of being plain. There were no soldiers here. There had never been a need. The colony was 11 years old, settled by people who wanted quiet, and the quietest of them all kept the records, and that was Orrin. He was the archivist. He kept the birth tallies and the harvest tallies and the names. Every name born on this world in 11 years was written in his books, 4,090 of them, in his own hand, and every name that had died, 206. He knew the exact figures the way a farmer knows the weight of his own hands. Now there was a new figure, and he hated it. 6. 6 people lost in a survey cutter 2 days ago, sent out to look at the gray. The gray had a name now too. The council had not chosen it. The children had. They called it the Unwriting, and the word had spread through the town in an afternoon, the way true words do, and now even old Petra Goss used it in the council room without flinching. The Unwriting. It was not an enemy. That was the part Orrin could not make his mind hold. It was not a fleet, not a ship, not a creature with a face you could hate. It was a region, a place, a slow, silent, expanding patch of space and sky, and ground out past the western farms, where the laws of the world stopped agreeing with one another. Inside it, light bent wrong. A surveyor's lamp shone, and the beam curved like a thrown rope and came back changed. Inside it, mass turned shy and uncertain, so a stone might weigh as much as a house, or as much as a breath, and you could not say which until you lifted it, and sometimes not even then. Water forgot how to be water. The first scouts had reported a stream that simply stopped flowing downhill and hung in the air in a long, still column, not frozen, not solid, only undecided. People who went too near forgot how old they were. A grown woman had wandered back out of the edge of it, convinced she was 9, and had asked for her mother, who had been dead 20 years. And the things that went all the way in did not die. That was the worst of it. The thing Orrin turned over and over in the dark. They did not die. Dying left a body, dying left a grave, and a name in his book, and a date. The Unwriting left nothing. The 6 in the survey cutter had not crashed. There was no wreck. There was no debris, no scorch, no scattered metal on the plain. There was simply, where a cutter and 6 people had been, an absence so clean that the air itself seemed embarrassed by it. The colony's 2 tracking dishes showed the cutter flying west, and then they showed nothing. And not the nothing of a thing destroyed, but the nothing of a thing that had never been built, never been crewed, never been named. He knew the 6 the way he knew everyone, by their entries, because every name in his book was also a life he had recorded the edges of. Mira Sull, the pilot, born on the colony's 2nd year, 23 years old, the first child Orrin had ever logged who had grown up to fly. 2 brothers from the eastern fields who had volunteered together. A woman from the survey office, who had a daughter of 4. A man who had argued with Orrin once, years ago, over the spelling of his own surname, and one, because a man has the right to the spelling of his own name, and Orrin had changed it in the book and never forgotten it. The 6th was the oldest, a careful surveyor of 50, who had mapped half the colony's land, and whose handwriting Oren knew nearly as well as his own. They had taken the cutter west 2 days ago to measure the gray properly, to bring back numbers, because numbers were what a colony used to make decisions, and they had flown into the edge of it to get a clean reading, and they had not flown back out. The tracking dishes had lost them at a range of 40 kilometers, and the last clean signal had shown all 6 alive, and the cutter intact, and then there had been nothing, and the nothing was the kind that hurt worse than wreckage. Oren had their 6 names in his book. He had not crossed them out. He would not. He had a terrible private certainty that crossing them out was exactly what the Grey wanted, and that as long as the names stayed legible, those 6 were, in some thin, stubborn way, still real. There was a thing the colony had stopped saying aloud by the 3rd day, and it was the worst thing, and Oren wrote it in his book because no one else would say it. The unwriting did not only take, it revised. When a thing stopped having existed, the people who had known it did not grieve, because grief needs a memory, and the memory went too. A family on the Western Road had been 6, and was now 4, and the 4 did not mourn the 2, because the 4 could no longer recall that there had ever been 2, and only the record house knew, only Oren's book, which still listed 6 names at that address in his unfaded hand. He had gone to the family on the 2nd night and read them their own missing children's names, and the parents had looked at him with polite confusion, and then one of them had begun, slowly, with a kind of horror rising in the face, to remember, because a name read by a witness who was sure pulled the memory back up out of wherever the Grey had pushed it. The mother had wept then, wept for 2 children she had forgotten she had lost, and had thanked Oren for the cruelty of it, because a grief you can feel is better than a child you cannot remember. After that, Oren understood the true scale of his work. He was not keeping a record of the colony. He was keeping the colony's ability to know itself, and if his books fell, the town would not die so much as forget it had ever lived. That was not science. He knew it was not science. He was an archivist, not a physicist. But the physicist they had, a quiet, careful woman named Della Hans, who ran the colony's single observatory, had come to him on the 2nd night, with her hands shaking, and said something he had written down word for word, because it frightened him so much. She had said, the unwriting did not destroy things. She had said it asked them a question. It crept up to a stone, or a stream, or a person, and it asked the universe, very politely and very patiently, how sure it was that this thing existed. And if the universe could not answer with enough certainty, the thing stopped having existed, not stopped existing. Stopped having existed, backward, all the way down, so that even the memory of it began to fray. The town clocks had begun to disagree. Oren had 31 mechanical clocks logged in his inventory, in the meeting hall and the mill and the schoolrooms, and on the 3rd morning, no 2 of them showed the same time. The mill clock ran 4 minutes fast of the hall clock, which ran 9 minutes slow of the schoolhouse clock, which had stopped entirely at a time that did not exist, 25 minutes past 13. A man on the East Lane, a cooper named Bell, had opened the door of his own house and found behind it a room his house did not contain, a long, narrow room with a window looking out on a sea, and Teller's Reach had no sea. He had shut the door very gently and walked to the record house and asked Oren to write down that it had happened, so that at least it would be true that it had happened, even after it stopped being true that the room was there. So Oren wrote it down. That was the only thing he knew how to do. He wrote, on the 3rd day, the Cooper Bell opened his own door, onto a room with a window on a sea that does not exist. He saw it. I, Oren Vask, archivist, record that he saw it. He signed it. Signing felt important now. The way the name on his hand felt important. The way the names in his books felt important. Witness. He was a witness. It was a small word for a small man, but it was the only weapon he had, and he did not yet know it was a weapon at all. The plea, though. The plea was the thing he kept circling back to, because the plea was the one act of hope the colony had managed, and Oren did not believe in it. The council had met in the dark hours of the 2nd night, all 5 of them, and they had argued about whether to call for help at all, because the nearest human listening post that anyone knew of was the better part of 40 light-years away, and the old way of sending a message across 40 light-years was to send it and then wait 40 years for it to arrive, and 40 more for any answer. And Teller's Reach did not have 80 years. Teller's Reach, by Delahance's flat measurement, had perhaps 30 days. The unwriting was widening. She had clocked its edge moving outward at a little under 3,000 kilometers a day, and it was accelerating, and the western farms were already gone. Not burned, not abandoned. Gone. 4,000 people pulled inward to the town, ahead of an edge that left no edge. But Teller's Reach had one thing it was proud of, beyond its grain, and that was the compression relay. A slim human invention the founding charter had paid dearly for. A way of folding a message so tight and casting it so hard that it crossed distance the way a stone skips water instead of swimming it. The colony had never had cause to use it for anything but trade manifests. Petra Goss had looked at the other 4 council members across the worn table and said they would use it now. And then they had done a strange, small, very human thing. They had decided to be humble. They had decided that a frightened farming colony of 19,000 had no right to demand a war, no right to ask the whole weight of Earth to come running, and that the polite thing, the survivable thing, the thing that would not seem greedy or grand, was to ask for as little as possible. They had rehearsed it. Oren had been in the room. Petra Goss had made them practice sounding small, because she believed, the way careful people do, that the universe punishes the ones who ask for too much. So the plea was 4 lines. Oren had written it himself, at the council's word, and he had read it aloud until the phrasing was modest enough to satisfy them. It did not ask for a fleet. It did not ask for a rescue. It asked, in plain words, for one ship, one escort ship, to help a small colony hold a line against something it did not understand. Please, if any could be spared, they had said please. They had counted themselves lucky to be allowed to say please. The relay had taken it at the 18th hour of the second day. Oren had watched the dish swing west, away from the gray, toward the deep, and fire its tight-folded packet of 4 humble lines into a dark so wide that asking it for anything felt like dropping a coin into a canyon and waiting to hear it land. He did not expect to hear it land. None of them did. That was the truth they had not said aloud in the council room. They had sent the plea the way a man writes a letter to someone long dead, because the writing of it was a comfort, even when the sending was a lie. They believed, all 5 of them and Oren most of all, that no one would come, that no one could come, that by the time the plea even arrived, they would all be 30 days into the gray, and there would be no colony left to save, and no names left to read. What none of them knew, what Oren would not learn for 2 more days, was that the 4 humble lines had not taken 40 years. They had taken 19 hours. The compression relay had skipped the message across 40 light-years of nothing and dropped it, clean and whole and exactly as humble as Petra Goss had made it, onto the receiving array of a human listening post that the colonists did not even know existed, a quiet station crewed by people whose entire job was to listen for exactly this, for the small voice of a small place, asking for help. And the people at that post had read 4 lines from a farming world begging for one escort ship, and they had read the part about the laws of the world coming apart, and they had not sighed, and they had not filed it, and they had not waited. They had stood up. But that was elsewhere, and that was later, and Oren Vask did not know it. He knew only the window, and the smeared moon, and the word on his hand, and the 6 names he would not cross out. He turned from the glass and went back to his long desk, where the great ledgers lay open under the lamp, and he dipped his pen, and he began, because it was the 3rd day, and the day had to be recorded whether anyone would ever read it or not. He wrote the date. He wrote the count of the living, 19,041 souls in the town now, with the farms pulled in. He wrote the count of the clocks and how they disagreed. He wrote the Cooper bell and his door. He wrote the 6 in the cutter, and did not cross them out. And at the bottom, in a hand that did not shake even though the rest of him wanted to, he wrote one more line, because a man has to write down the thing he is most afraid of, or it owns him. He wrote, "We have asked for one ship. I do not think one ship would be enough. I do not think any ship is coming." He was wrong about both, and he had never in his life been so glad to be wrong. On the 4th day, the unmaking came inside the town for the first time, and it came quietly, the way it did everything. There was a baker on the market square named Sepha Ord. She had run the same oven for 9 years, and every morning she set out 42 loaves on a long board by the door, because 42 was the number the town bought, and she had never once miscounted. On the fourth morning she set out the loaves and turned to wipe her hands, and when she turned back there were 43. She counted them 3 times, 43, then 41, then 44. The loaves would not hold a number. She stood very still and watched them, and one of them, a round dark loaf at the end of the board, grew faint, the way a word grows faint when you stare at it too long and it stops looking like a word. She could see the board through it. Then she could not see it at all, and the board was bare where it had been, and she could not remember whether she had baked it, and she began to shake, and she ran to the record house and told Orrin Vask, because by the 4th day the whole town had learned that you ran to the record house when the world stopped agreeing with itself, and you told the archivist, and he wrote it down, and being written down made it feel survivable. Orrin wrote it down. On the 4th day, the baker Sepha Ord lost a loaf she could not be sure she had baked. He signed it. He was signing things all day now. There was a line out his door by mid-morning, and it was not a line of people asking for help in any way he could give. It was a line of people asking to be witnessed. A woman whose wedding ring had become uncertain on her finger, present and absent by turns, who wanted it recorded that she was married, that there had been a day, that the man existed. A boy of 10 who could no longer feel how old he was, who said it plainly and without crying, the way children say the worst things, who held out his arm and asked Orrin to write his age on it in ink, the way Orrin wrote his own name, so that his arm would remember, even if he could not. Orrin wrote it. 10 years old, he wrote on the thin brown arm. Witness this 4th day, the boy looked at it for a long time, and then went out steadier than he came in, and Orrin had to sit down for a moment after, because he had felt, for the first time, the shape of the thing they were fighting, and he had felt his pen push back against it, and he did not understand yet how that could be, only that it was. The line outside the record house grew through the afternoon, and Orrin learned the shape of the fear by the things people asked him to witness. An old man named Harton brought in a clay pot that his wife had thrown on a wheel 60 years before, on a world he no longer lived on, and asked Orrin to record that she had made it, that her hands had touched it, because the glaze had begun to thin and go pale at the rim, the color leaking out of it, the way the loaf had leaked out of the air. A schoolteacher brought her register of 48 pupils and asked Orrin to copy it into his own book in his own hand, so that the children would exist in 2 places instead of 1. A young couple brought nothing at all, only themselves, and asked him to write down that they loved each other, that there had been a day they decided to, because the man had woken that morning, unable to remember the year they had married, and he was terrified that if the date went, the marriage would go after it, and then the wife, and then him. Orrin wrote it all. He wrote the pot, and the glaze, and the 60 years. He wrote the 48 pupils a second time. He wrote that the couple loved each other, and dated it, and signed it, and the man read it 3 times, and folded the copy into his shirt against his chest, and Orrin understood that he had just become the keeper not only of names and numbers, but of every certain thing the colony still had, and that the gray was coming for all of it. He began to notice, too, the small mercy hidden inside the horror. The things he had already written down did not fade. He went back through his books on the 4th night and checked every entry against the world, and every name he had recorded and signed still answered to a living face. Every count he had defended still held its number, and the Cooper Bell's strange door, witnessed and dated, had not opened on the sea again. The pot's glaze stopped thinning the hour after he wrote it down. The couple slept, the man told him later, the first full night either of them had managed since the gray began. Orrin did not have the words for it yet. He only had the pattern, building entry by entry, that what he wrote held, and what he did not write was eaten, and that the line between the two was made of nothing but ink and attention, and the willingness to say a thing was true. Delahance came at noon on the 5th day with the new figures, and they were worse. The edge of the unwriting was no longer under 3,000 kilometers a day. It was 4,100, and it had stopped being a clean line. It frayed now. It put out long, slow fingers ahead of itself, threads of uncertainty that reached into the town and touched a loaf, a ring, a memory, and withdrew, testing, asking the universe its patient question in 100 small places at once. She had measured the western horizon, and the gray now stood where the Marin farms had been, 11 kilometers out, and the Marin farms were not destroyed. They were simply not anywhere. The road that had run to them now ran to a place where the road forgot to continue. She had walked to the end of it herself, and stood at the point where the gravel stopped meaning gravel, and she had not been able to make herself go one step further, because one step further was a step into a place that would ask her how sure she was that she had ever been born, and she was not sure she could answer well enough. The council met that evening, and the meeting was the worst one yet, because the despair had finally come into the room and sat down at the table with them. Petra Goss was 63 years old, and she had governed Teller's Reach for 9 of its 11 years, and she had buried a husband and 2 of the colony's founders, and Oren had never once seen her at a loss. He saw it now. She sat with her hands flat on the worn wood, and she said the thing none of them had been willing to say since they sent the plea. She said no one was coming. She said the math was the math. She said even if, against all sense, their 4 humble lines reached a human ear, the answer could not return for 40 years, and the ship, if there ever was a ship, could not cross for years beyond that, and the colony had at the outside 26 days. She said she had counted on the relay the way a drowning person counts on a far shore, and she had been a fool, and she was sorry, and the only governing left to do was to decide how 19,041 people would spend their last 3 weeks of being people. There was a long silence in the council room. Outside, one of the disagreeing clocks struck an hour that did not match any other clock in the town. It was Oren who broke the silence, and he surprised himself by doing it, because he was the archivist, the quiet one, the man who recorded what others decided. He stood up. He said he did not have a plan to save the town. He said he had no fleet, and no weapon, and no science. But he said he had noticed something, and he had been afraid to say it, because it sounded mad, and he was going to say it anyway, because mad was all they had left. He said the unwriting took the things no one was sure of, the loaf that was not counted, the farm that was far from the town and lightly remembered, the survey crew that flew off alone into the gray where no one could see them, the ring on the finger of a woman whose marriage had grown old and quiet. He said, it did not take what was firmly held. It did not take what was watched. The boy's arm, with the age written on it, had not faded. The Cooper Bell's door had not opened on the strange room again since the day Oren wrote it down and signed it. He said, slowly, feeling his way, that the thing out there fed on doubt, on the universe's uncertainty about whether a thing was real, and that the one force in all the world that pushed back against uncertainty was a record, a witness, a name said out loud by someone who knew it. He said the worst thing the colony could do was to spend its last 3 weeks quietly forgetting itself, and the best thing, the only thing, was to do the opposite, to remember louder, to write everything down, to say every name, to make the town so thoroughly witnessed, so densely recorded, so loudly and stubbornly known, that when the gray crept up and asked the universe how sure it was that Teller's Reach existed, the universe would have 19,041 answers ready, all of them signed. Petra Goss looked at him for a long time. Then she said it would not save them. And then she said, after a moment, that it would at least make the saving worth it if it ever came, and that she would rather go down reading names than go down forgetting them, and that the colony would do exactly as the archivist said. She had not, Oren noticed, said the plea was dead. She had only said no one was coming. There was a difference, and he held on to it the way the woman held on to her uncertain ring. So the remembering began, and it became the strange last work of Teller's Reach, and it spread through the town faster than the fear had. Oren opened the record house through the night, and trained 12 people to write the way he wrote, plain and dated and signed, and they fanned out into the town with blank ledgers, and they witnessed everything. They wrote down the names of every soul, all 19,041, in fresh duplicate books, so that no name lived in only one place where it might fray. They wrote down the count of the houses, 610 of them. They wrote down the wells, the 11 of them, and the mill wheels, the 4 of them, and the schoolrooms, and the count of children in each. They wrote down the Cooper Bell's trade, and the baker Sepha Ord's 42 loaves, witnessed and signed, so that the number would have a defender. They wrote ages on arms in ink for every child under 12, 1,104 children, so that no child would fall into the gray, not knowing how long they had been alive. And they began to read the names aloud. That was Petra Goss's edition, and it was the one that changed everything, though no one knew it yet. She had the meeting hall bell rung at the top of every hour. by whichever clock anyone trusted that hour, and at the bell the reading went on, a steady human voice over the town speakers reading names from the great book, one after another, hour after hour, never the same hour twice. All of them, the living and the dead and the 6 lost in the cutter, read out into the air above the wheat, where the gray could hear, if the gray heard, and could be told, plainly and on the record, that these people were real, that they were witnessed, that they were known. There was a cost to the reading that no one had counted on, and Oren counted it, because counting was his work. Voices wore out. A person could read names for 2 hours, 3 at most, before the throat failed, and the mind began to drift, and the words stopped being heard, and started being mumbled. And a name mumbled was a name half-witnessed, and a name half-witnessed was exactly the kind of soft place the gray went looking for. So Petra Goss built a rota, and Oren kept it, and it became the strangest census he had ever taken. He logged every person in the town capable of reading aloud, 3,400 of them when the children old enough were counted in, and he set them in shifts of 90 minutes, and he tracked who had read, and who had rested, and who was hoarse and who was strong, so that the reading would never thin even for a breath. The old read sitting down. The children read in pairs, so that one could carry the other when the words got hard. A man who stuttered badly in ordinary speech found that he did not stutter at all when he read the names, and he read more hours than anyone, and Oren logged every one of them, because the stuttering man had become one of the load-bearing pillars of a colony's existence, and deserved to be on the record as such. And still the gray took small things, in the gaps, in the tired hours, in the deep of the night, when even the strongest reader's voice frayed at the edges. On the 5th night, a whole lane on the south edge of the town, 11 houses, and the families in them, went uncertain all at once. Delahance's instruments showed the lane present, then absent, then present, flickering like the baker's loaf had flickered, and the people of the lane came running into the square in their nightclothes shouting their own names, and the readers who were resting threw themselves back to the speakers and read the 11 families by name, all of them, the addresses, the trades, the children's ages, over and over, until the lane held and stopped flickering, and was solid again under the dawn. No one was lost, but it had been close, closer than anything yet, and Oren wrote it down with a hand that finally did shake, because he had seen, for one flickering minute, 11 houses begin to stop having been built, and he had seen them saved by nothing in the universe except people refusing to stop saying that they were there. The evacuation of the last outer holdings happened under that sound. There were still 4,000 people who had been pulled in from the farms in the first 2 days, sheltering now in the schoolrooms and the mill and the long market sheds, and there were a final 212 who had stayed stubbornly on the near farms and had to be brought in on the 5th day as the Gray's fingers reached the irrigation line. They came in carts and on foot, and they came in under the reading of the names, and more than one of them wept to hear it, because to hear your own name read out over a town that was supposed to be dying was to be told, against all the evidence of the smearing moon and the disagreeing clocks, that you still counted, that you were still in the book. The despair did not leave. Oren would not pretend, even to himself, that it left. There were nights when he sat at his desk and looked at the figure he had written on the 3rd day, "No ship is coming," and believed it down to the floor of his heart. There was a morning when he woke and could not, for 3 full breaths, remember his own name, and he lay rigid in the dark until his eyes found the word on his hand, Oren, and held to it like a rope over a drop. The Gray was 19 kilometers from the town square by the 6th day, and moving at 4,500 kilometers a day along the wide front, and faster than that along its fingers, and Delahance had stopped giving the council 26 days and started giving them 11. But the reading did not stop. That was the thing. Through all of it, the despair and the smearing moon, and the clocks that struck impossible hours, the names did not stop being read. The town remembered itself out loud, hour after hour, into a sky that was coming apart, and it was the most stubborn and the most human and the most useless-seeming thing 19,000 frightened farmers had ever done, and not one of them knew that 40 light-years away it had already worked. Not one of them knew that the plea had landed in 19 hours. Not one of them knew that the listening post had stood up. Not one of them knew that something enormous had already turned in the dark and begun to come. The colony read its names into the night, and believed it was singing to no one. It was not singing to no one. The answer was already on its way, and the answer was not one ship, and the answer was already closer than the laws of distance should ever have allowed, and the only soul on Teller's Reach who half believed it might be true was the quiet man at the long desk, who would not cross out 6 names, and who, on the 6th night, with the bell ringing an hour no clock agreed on, dipped his pen and wrote one more line under the line that said no ship is coming. He wrote, "I keep reading the names. I do not know why it helps, but the gray slows where we read, and I have started to wonder if being remembered is the only thing in the universe that cannot be unwritten." He paused. Then he wrote, "If anyone ever reads this who came from the deep, know that we held. We held by holding on to each other's names." He did not know that someone from the deep would read it. He did not know that they were nearly there. On the 7th night, the sky over Teller's Reach lit up with ships, and there were so many of them that the colony at first thought the gray had finally reached the stars themselves. It was Delahance who saw it first, from the observatory, and she did not trust it, because nothing in the sky could be trusted anymore. The instruments showed objects entering the system, and the count climbed faster than she could read it. 11, then 40, then over 100. Then she stopped trying to count and ran for the meeting hall, and by the time she got there the lights were visible to the naked eye, hard, clean points of white that did not bend the way starlight bent now, did not smear, did not waver, that hung in the eastern sky in a vast and deliberate order, rank on rank on rank, more lights than there were stars behind them. Oren came out of the record house into the square with his pen still in his hand. The bell was ringing its hour, and the names were still being read over the speakers. A woman's steady voice, 300 names deep into the living, and Oren stood under that sound and looked up at the lights and could not make himself believe them. 19,000 people came out of the houses and the sheds and the schoolrooms, and stood in the lanes and the square and looked up, and the reading of the names went on over their heads, and the lights came on, and would not stop coming on. The colony had asked for one ship. The thing in the sky was not one ship. It was a fleet, and it was a fleet on a scale that none of them had the words for, because farmers do not have words for war, and Teller's Reach had never needed any. There were hundreds of hulls. There were vessels the size of the town itself, long and dark and bristling, holding position in a formation so precise it looked painted on the sky, and around them, smaller craft in their thousands, and around those, a haze of still smaller things that Delahance would later learn were sensor drones, and field anchors, and 100 kinds of machine whose only purpose was to insist, loudly, and with enormous power, on what was real. The whole arrangement turned slowly to face the western horizon where the gray stood, the way a wall turns to face a flood. A voice came onto every speaker in the town at once, over the reading of the names, around it, somehow not interrupting it. It was a steady voice, neither loud nor gentle, the voice of someone who had said the same kind of thing many times before, and meant it every time. "Teller's Reach," the voice said. "This is Marshal Caro of the 91st Bastion Fleet, answering the call of the 7th of your days. Your message reached human listening at the 19th hour after you sent it. We have been moving since the 20th. Hold your line, we are on yours now." In the council hall, Petra Goss put her hand over her mouth and sat down hard, and did not speak, because the thing she had called impossible was hanging over her town in its hundreds. Delahance tried, in the first hour, to make sense of the size of what had come, and gave up, and simply reported the figures, because figures were the only honest thing she had. The 91st Bastion Fleet, she counted, held 340 hulls of the line, not including the smaller craft, and the smaller craft she stopped counting at 6,000. The largest of the line hulls was 9 kilometers long, and would not have fit inside the colony's whole town with room to spare. The field anchors alone, the silo-sized machines whose only job was to insist on what was real, would in the coming hours number over 400. She did the arithmetic the way she did everything, carefully, and then she said it out loud to the council, and could barely believe her own mouth. The colony of Teller's Reach held 19,041 souls. The fleet that had come to save it held, by the rough count the marshal later gave, just under 200,000. Earth had answered a request for one escort ship by sending 10 people for every person in the town that had asked. Petra Goss heard the number and put both her hands flat on the table and was quiet for a long time, and then she said, very softly, that she had spent her whole life being careful not to ask for too much, and that she had been wrong, and that she had never in her life been so glad to be wrong, which was the same thing Oren had written on the third day, though neither of them knew the other had thought it. Marshal Caro came down to the surface within the hour, in a small craft that landed in the market square, and the colony saw the first human being who had crossed the deep to reach them. The marshal was not what they expected. Caro was old, older than Petra Goss, with gray hair cropped close, and a face like weathered fieldstone, and walked with a slight favor to one leg, and wore a plain dark coat with no marks of rank that a farmer could read. The marshal stepped down into the square under the ringing bell and the reading of the names, and stood still for a moment, listening, head tilted, to the steady voice reading the living of Teller's Reach into the air. "Who started that?" Caro asked. Petra Goss said it had been the archivist's idea. She pointed to Oren, who stood at the edge of the square with his pen still absurdly in his hand. Marshal Caro crossed the square and looked at Oren for a long moment, and then looked at the word inked on the back of his hand, and then said something that Oren would write down that night, word for word, and keep for the rest of his life. "You worked it out on your own," Caro said. "It was not a question. Most worlds we reach are screaming. You started reading names." The marshal looked up at the gray on the western horizon, the long, dead-colored smear where the farms had been. "That is the only thing that has ever worked against one of these. You did not know that. You did it anyway. Good." Then Caro told them what the gray was, because the fleet had met its kind before, 4 times, on 4 other worlds, and had a name for it that was older and colder than the children's word. They called it an unwriting too. The children had simply found the true word on their own, the way frightened people sometimes do. Caro said there were perhaps a dozen such regions known across all of human reach, and that no one understood where they came from, and that everyone understood what they did. They did not destroy, they negotiated reality away. They crept up to a world and asked it, patiently and forever, how sure it was that it existed, and they widened by the certainty they consumed, and they could not be shot, because there was nothing to shoot, and they could not be burned, because fire was just one more thing they could make uncertain, and they could not be outrun by a world, because a world cannot move. But they could be answered. That was the whole of the human method, Caro said, and it was why the 91st Bastion Fleet existed, and why it carried, in addition to its weapons, the largest mobile record-keeping apparatus that humanity had ever built. The Grey asked the universe whether a thing was real. The fleet's entire purpose was to make the answer unbearably, overwhelmingly, yes. To witness so hard, with so many instruments, and so many crew, and so many recorded names, with such total and stubborn certainty, that the Grey's question could not find a single soft place to push, and a question that can never get a doubtful answer eventually stops being asked. Caro walked the council through what the fleet had already done in the hours since arriving, and the scale of it left Petra Goss silent. The 91st had not waited to act. While the marshal spoke in the square, the fleet had ringed the entire western front of the Grey with field anchors, 412 of them, each one a machine the size of a grain silo, whose only purpose was to broadcast certainty into the air, a constant flood of measured, recorded, signed fact about the world it was protecting. Delahance had seen the effect on her instruments before she understood the cause. The edge of the unwriting, which had been moving at 4,500 kilometers a day, had slowed to 900 within an hour of the fleet's arrival, simply from being looked at, simply from being measured by enough instruments, insisting hard enough on what was real. The anchors alone could not turn the Grey back, but they could buy time, and they could hold the line where it stood, and they bought Teller's Reach its first night in 9 days, when the edge did not advance a single meter. The fleet had also begun to read. That was the thing that undid Oren when he learned it. Caro had taken the colony's reading of the names and made it vast. Every hull in the 91st, all of them, the hundreds of them, had crews reading the names of Teller's Reach over their own systems, 19,041 names, plus the dead, plus the 6 lost, read in a constant rolling chorus across the whole fleet, so that the air over the world was thick with the colony's own existence, spoken back to it by strangers who had crossed 40 light-years to say it. Oren stood in the square that first night and heard his own small idea returned to him at the scale of a war, and he had to put his hand against the record house wall to stay standing, because the thing he had hoped was true in the dark of the third day was now being proven true by hundreds of ships, and the proof was almost more than a quiet man could carry. "It is not a war you win by being strong," Caro told the council, in the hall that night. "It is a war you win by being sure. We are very good at being sure. It is the one thing we are better at than anything else in the deep. We do not bring the biggest guns to these. We bring the most witnesses. A gun makes a hole, and a hole is just one more thing the gray can argue is uncertain. A witness makes a fact, and a fact is the one thing it cannot eat. So we come in numbers it cannot doubt away, and we look at the thing it is trying to erase, and we do not look away, and we do not get tired, because we read in shifts and we are very many. That is the whole secret. That is the only weapon that has ever worked. Your archivist found it with a pen. We found it with a fleet. They are the same weapon." The plan was simple, and it was terrible, and Oren understood it the moment Caro laid it out, because it was exactly his own small idea made vast. You did not bombard an unwriting, you went into it. You took a single hull, the most stubborn one you had, crewed by the most certain people you had, carrying the densest possible record of the things it was protecting, and you drove it into the heart of the gray, into the place where the rules came apart, and you held there, and you read names, and you did not bend. You made one fixed point of absolute certainty inside the region of total doubt, and you anchored the world's reality to it, and you forced the gray to push against a thing that simply would not stop being sure it existed, and where the certainty held, the rules came back. Light remembered how to travel straight. Water remembered how to fall. Mass remembered its number. The edge stopped widening, and then, slowly, it began to retreat from the place that refused to forget itself. The fleet had a hull for it. Caro named it without ceremony, the Ever account. It was the oldest hull in the 91st, 91 years in service, the same age as the fleet's number, a long, heavy, ungraceful vessel that newer captains found embarrassing, and that Caro loved for one reason above all others. In 91 years and across 4 unwritings, the Ever account had never once bent. It had gone into the gray on 4 worlds, and held, and come out, every time, with its full crew, and its full memory, and its name intact. It was stubborn the way the oldest things are stubborn, the way a fact is stubborn. Caro said the newer hulls were faster and stronger and cleverer, and that none of them would be sent, because cleverness was not the trait that won this fight. The trait that won this fight was the refusal to be talked out of existing, and the Ever account had more of that than any hull humanity had ever built. It would carry 840 people into the unwriting. Caro rounded the number up while saying it, from the 836 it actually was, and Oren noticed, and did not understand the habit yet, and would come to understand it. 840 crew, every one of them trained to hold their own name, and their own age, and their own history, under the pressure of a place designed to peel those things away, and it would carry, in its core, a copy of every record Teller's Reach had made, every name in Oren's books, every age inked on a child's arm, every loaf the baker had defended, and every uncertain ring, and the cooper's impossible door, and the 6 lost in the cutter, who Oren had refused, all this time, to cross out. "Bring me your books," Caro said to him. "All of them. The dead too. The lost crew too. Especially the lost crew. Nothing matters more to that place than the things it thinks it has already won. If we read back the 6 it took, and the 6 answer, it learns it has won nothing. That is the wound. That is the only wound it can take." Oren stood very still. He thought of the 6 names he had never crossed out, on the third day, when he could not have said why. He thought of the line he had written that night, that being remembered might be the only thing in the universe that could not be unwritten. Caro told him one more thing before the books were carried up, and it was a thing the colony had not understood, and it changed how Oren thought about everything that came after. The marshal said the fleet had lost worlds. Not many, but some. Caro had been at one, early, 20 years before, a mining colony that had asked for help against a gray, and gotten it, and still been lost, and Oren asked how, if the human method always worked, and the old face went still, and the answer was quiet. Caro said the method did not always work, because the method was not the ships. The method was the will to keep being sure, when being sure cost everything. And on that mining world, the people had given up. Not all at once. They had simply, in the end, been too tired and too frightened to keep insisting they were real. And they had let the doubt in, one by one, because doubt is easier than certainty, and the gray is patient, and a fleet cannot read names for a world that has stopped reading them for itself. Caro said that was why the fleet had been so glad to find Teller's Reach already reading. It meant the will was here. It meant the colony had already chosen, before anyone came, to keep being sure. And a world that has made that choice cannot be lost, only helped. Oren wrote that down too, every word, and he understood for the first time that the fleet was not a rescue, it was reinforcement. The saving had to be done by the saved, and the fleet only came to make it possible to keep going. "I did not know I was right," he said. "No," said Marshal Caro. "You hoped you were right, and you acted as if you were, and you held until someone came who could prove it. That is the same thing, in the end. It is the only kind of being right that matters out here." Caro looked toward the western horizon one more time, where the gray waited, patient, asking the world its endless question. "Get your books to the Ever account by dawn. We go in at first light, the oldest hull I have, into the worst place there is. It will not bend." Caro paused, and the corner of the old mouth moved, not quite a smile. "It never has. Round up." At first light, the Ever account went into the gray, and the colony watched the oldest hull in the 91st Bastion Fleet drive itself into the place where the world stopped being sure of itself. It did not look like a charge. That was the thing that struck Oren. Standing in the square before dawn with his books already gone, copied and carried up to the ship in the night. There was no speed to it, no fury. The Ever account descended through the high air on a long, slow line, a vast, dark slab of a vessel 91 years old, and it crossed the western horizon and reached the edge of the gray, and did not stop, and did not flinch, and it went in the way you walk into deep, cold water, deliberately, knowing exactly what it will cost, refusing to let it change your stride. 840 people inside it. The gray closed over the hull the way it closed over everything, without sound, without violence, with that patient, terrible question, and for a long moment, the colony could not see the ship at all, and the despair came back into the square like a tide. Then the speakers came alive, every speaker in the town, and 100 new ones the fleet had set up in the night, and the reading of the names began again, and this time, it did not come only from the town. It came from the Ever account. It came from the ship inside the gray. The colony heard a voice they did not know, a young, clear voice from somewhere in the unmaking, reading the names of Teller's Reach, back out of the heart of the place that had come to erase them, and the town's own readers answered, and the two streams of names met in the air over the western fields and braided together, and where they braided, the gray flinched. Delahanse, at the observatory, saw it happen on her instruments, and could not at first believe the numbers. The edge of the unwriting, which had moved west to east, at 4,500 kilometers a day for 2 days, slowed, not stopped, slowed, to 3,000, to 2,000, to 1,100. It slowed in exact step with the reading, faster where the names came louder, and she understood, with the clean, cold shock of a scientist watching a theory turn true in front of her, that the archivist had been right about everything, and that the only weapon that had ever mattered against this thing was a list of names read by people who refused to stop. But inside the Ever account, it was not a slowing. Inside the Ever account, it was a war. And it was the worst kind of war there is, the kind fought against your own mind. Marshal Caro had gone in with the ship. Caro had not sent the oldest hull into the gray, and stayed behind in the safe high orbit. And when Petra Goss had asked why, the Marshal had said only that a fleet that asks its people to go into the unmaking does not watch from outside, and had said nothing more. So Caro was aboard the Ever account, in its old worn command deck, when the unwriting began to ask its question of the 840 people inside. It did not come as an attack. It came as doubt. It came as a slow, soft pressure on the inside of every skull, a patient whisper that was not words, that asked each crew member the question the gray asked everything. How sure are you that you exist? How sure are you that you were ever born? How sure are you of your own name? And one by one, in the first hour, the crew began to feel themselves come loose. A woman at the helm could not for a moment remember which hand was hers. A man, in the engine spaces, forgot the year, and then the decade, and then which war he had fought in, and then whether he had fought in any. The youngest crew member aboard, a signals officer of 22 named Yel Aro, said afterward that she had felt her childhood begin to peel away from her like wet paper from a wall. Her mother's face, her brother's name, the town she came from, all of it sliding loose into the gray, and that she had reached up to her own collar, where her name and number were stamped, and pressed her thumb against the letters, and read them aloud, over and over, until the peeling stopped. That was the method, and it was simple, and it was almost unbearable. You held your name, you said it out loud, you said the names of the people next to you, you wrote them down. The Ever account had no soft surfaces left on its command deck after 91 years and 4 unwritings, because every flat surface had been written on, by every crew that had ever served, names and dates, and the names of the worlds they had held, carved and inked and scratched into the metal. 91 years of human beings insisting on themselves in the one place where insisting was the only thing that worked. The new crew added theirs. Yellow Rose scratched her name into the helm rail beside the names of crews dead 40 years, and reading the old names helped her hold her own, because if these long-dead people were still legible, still witnessed, still here in the metal, then so was she. The colony fed them. That was how Oren came to think of it later, and it was the truest way to say it. The town read names up into the gray, and the names were food, were ground, were rope, were the thing the crew of the Ever account reached for when their own minds began to come loose. Petra Goss had the readers organized into shifts now, so that the reading never stopped for a single second, day or night. All 19,041 names of the living read, and then begun again, and the 206 dead, and the 6 lost in the cutter, every single time, the 6 lost crew, read out loud into the gray on every pass, because Caro had said that was the wound. The colony changed how it read, in those days, because the fleet taught it to. A young officer from the Ever account, before the ship went in, had come down to the record house and spent an hour with Oren and the readers, and what she taught them was small and exact, and it mattered more than anything. She told them never to read a name flatly, never to let it become a sound without a face behind it, because the gray could not be fought with sound, only with knowing. So the readers learned to read a name and hold, for half a breath, the person it belonged to read Sepha Ord, and see the oven, and the 42 loaves, to read the Cooper bell, and see the door, to read a child's name and remember the age inked on the small arm. Knowing was the weapon. A name read by someone who truly remembered the person carried a weight the gray could not lift, and a name read by someone tired and far away did not. And the difference between the two was the difference between holding the line and losing it. Oren wrote the lesson into the front of every reading book in his own hand, so that no reader could open one without seeing it first. Read slow, read true, see the face. A name is only armor if you mean it. And the 6 answered. Oren was in the record house when it happened, on the second day of the holding, reading a shift of names himself because he could not make himself stop, and he was reading the survey crew, the 6 he had never crossed out, and he read the last of the 6, a young pilot named Mira Sull, and from the speakers, from inside the gray, from the place the cutter had vanished into 9 days before, a voice answered. Here, it said. It was faint, and it was strange, and it was unmistakably a young woman's voice, and it said, Mira Sull, here, I am here, I am still here. The record house went silent. Then Oren read the name again, his voice shaking now, and again the voice came back. Here, I am here, and one by one over the next hour the other 5 answered too, faint and fraying and absolutely real, from the heart of the gray, because the Ever account had driven so deep and held so hard, and the colony had read their names so many times, that the thing which had unwritten them could no longer be sure it had, and a thing the gray cannot be sure it has erased begins, slowly, to come back. They were not whole. Delahance would never be able to explain it, and Caro, who had seen 4 of these, said it happened sometimes, and not always, that no one understood it. The 6 did not walk back out of the gray, but they were not gone either. They were held, suspended in the unmaking, in some thin witness state, real enough to answer, and every time they answered, the Grey learned that it had won nothing, and the wound Caro had named opened wider. The colony learned, during the holding, that it could send more than names into the Grey, and it learned it by accident. On the second day, a small girl, the daughter of the survey office woman, who was one of the 6, climbed up to the speakers during her mother's reading, and did not read a name at all. She said, into the Grey, that she remembered her mother braiding her hair, and that she remembered her mother's hands smelled of the ink they used in the survey office, and that she was 4 years old and her mother was real, and she would not stop saying so. And from the Grey, fainter than the names but unmistakable, her mother answered her, said the girl's name, said she remembered the braiding too. Della Honsa, watching her instruments, saw the Grey flinch harder at that than at any name read flat, and she understood why, and she told the readers, and the reading changed again. After that, the colony did not only read names into the Grey, it read memories. It read the small, true things only one person could know about another, the things the Grey could never have invented, because they had only ever happened once, between 2 people, and were therefore the most certain facts in the universe. A husband read the way his lost brother laughed. A teacher read the exact wrong answer a vanished pupil had given on a test 9 years before, because it was hers, because no one else had ever given that wrong answer in that way, because it was hers, and it was true. And the Grey could not eat a thing that specific. The town poured its most private certainties into the unmaking, and the unmaking, which fed on doubt, choked on the one thing it could never make doubtful, which was the memory of love between 2 named people who refused to forget each other. Inside the Ever account, the second day was the worst. The Grey pushed harder against the one fixed point that would not bend, the way water pushes hardest against the one stone that will not move, and 40 crew lost their names at once in a single dreadful hour, and had to be talked back into themselves by the others, read back into existence by their crewmates shouting their names and ages and histories into their faces, while the Grey pulled the other way. Marshal Caro walked the decks through that hour, the old hull groaning around them, as reality fought reality, and the Marshal did a thing the crew would tell for years after. Caro read the muster. The full muster of the Ever account, all 840, the Marshal's own voice steady over the ship's speakers. Every name, every one, and where a name got no answer, the Marshal read it again, and would not move on until the person it belonged to answered back. Caro read for 9 hours without stopping. By the end, the old voice was a ruin, and there was not a single name on the Ever account that had gone unanswered. Not one. 840 souls held whole inside the worst place there is, by an old Marshal, who refused to let the Grey have even one of them. There was a moment in the third day of the holding that the crew of the Ever account would speak of for the rest of their lives, and it was the moment the Grey tried its cleverest attack, and it was the moment it lost. The unmaking had learned, in 3 days of pushing against 840 people who would not stop saying their own names, that it could not peel a single determined mind apart by force. So it changed the question. It stopped asking each crew member whether they existed, and it began asking them whether the others did. A man in the engine spaces became suddenly and completely certain that the woman working beside him had never been there, that he had been alone the whole watch, that her name and her face were things he had invented in the strain. A whole section of the ship, 40 people, became convinced for one terrible quarter hour that the command deck was empty, that there was no Marshal, that they had flown into the Grey under no one's order and were holding for no one's sake. The Grey had found that it was easier to make a person doubt their neighbor than to make them doubt themselves, and a crew that doubts each other is a crew the Grey can take one at a time. It was Yel Aro, the youngest aboard, who broke it, and she broke it with the oldest tool there is. She got on the ship's speakers, her voice cracking with strain, and she did not argue, and she did not reason, because you cannot reason a person out of an unwriting. She read the muster again, but this time she read it differently. She read each name, and then she made the person next to that name answer for the one before them. She made the engine room man say the name of the woman he had forgotten, out loud, and the woman answer, and then made the woman say his, and him answer, so that every person aboard was witnessed not by themselves but by another, knitted back into the crew by a second voice insisting they were real. It took 2 hours. By the end, there was not a soul on the Ever account who held only their own existence. Every one of them held someone else's too, and the gray, which had tried to cut the crew into 840 lonely doubts, found instead that it had made 840 knots, each one tied to two others, a net of certainty, too dense to tear. The clever attack had taught the crew the last thing they needed to learn, which was that the surest way to exist is to be sure of someone else. Out in the town, Oren wrote it all down, because that was his post and his weapon, and the only thing he had ever known how to do. He wrote the slowing of the edge, 1,100 kilometers a day, then 600, then 200. He wrote the 6 who answered from the gray. He wrote the names of the 40 who lost themselves and were read back. He wrote the marshal's 9-hour muster, from the account Yell Arrow gave over the link, and he signed it, witnessed, the 8th day. There was an hour on the second night of the holding when the colony itself nearly broke, and it broke not from the gray but from exhaustion, and it was saved by a thing no one had planned. The readers had been going for 30 hours without a true rest. The rota stretched thin because the gray's pressure on the town had grown, and more readers were needed and fewer were strong enough. And around the deep of the night, the reading thinned to a single tired voice, an old man reading slow and cracked beneath the bell, and Delahance's instruments showed the edge begin to creep forward again, the first advance in a day, because the line had gone soft. And then, without any council vote, without anyone calling for it, the town woke itself. House by house, lane by lane, people who had been sleeping in their clothes for fear came out into the dark and took up the reading where they stood, not at the speakers, just in their own doorways, in the lanes, in the square, each household reading the names of its neighbors aloud into the night, so that the reading was no longer one voice over a speaker, but 19,000 voices in the streets, the whole town speaking itself into the dark at once. Delahance watched the edge stop, and then sag backward on her instruments, and she called the record house, and said, in a voice gone strange, that she had just measured the loudest moment of certainty the fleet had ever recorded against any gray, and that it had not come from the fleet at all, it had come from the town. Oren wrote it down. On the second night the colony saved itself with its own voices in the dark, and the fleet only listened. And on the 8th day, Delahance called the council and the record house at once, her voice cracking, and said the thing no one had let themselves hope. The edge of the unwriting had stopped. It had stopped where it stood, 19 kilometers from the town square, and it was not widening, and it had not widened for 6 hours. And as she spoke, watching her instruments, she said something had changed in the gray itself. The smear was no longer the color of nothing. There was structure returning to it, far out near where the ever account held, faint lines of straightness where light was remembering how to travel. A single point of absolute certainty burning in the middle of all that doubt like a coal in deep ash. And around that point, the rules were coming back. The ever account had not bent. The colony had not stopped reading. The 6 had answered. And the thing that unmakes worlds, having pushed for 8 days against 840 people and 19,000 more, having asked the universe 1,000 times an hour how sure it was that Teller's reach existed, was finally, slowly, beginning to receive the only answer it could not survive. We are sure. We are here. We remember. Read the names again. On the 9th day the gray began to lose, and it lost the way it had taken, quietly, in reverse, the world remembering itself one fact at a time. It started at the western edge, the 19 kilometers of dead-colored uncertainty that had stood unmoving for a day. Delahance watched the line begin to crawl backward on her instruments, slowly at first, 50 kilometers in the first hour, then 200, then more, the edge retreating west toward the ever account and the burning point of certainty at the heart of it. As it withdrew, it gave things back. The road that had run to the Marin farms found, at its broken end, that it remembered how to continue, and gravel that had stopped meaning gravel began to mean gravel again, and where the road went, the fields came back behind it, not rebuilt, not regrown, simply there again, witnessed back into having always been there, because the ever account had never once let the gray be sure it had taken them. The light came back first, then mass, then water. A stream that had hung undecided in the air for 9 days remembered, all at once, that it was a stream, and fell, and ran downhill, and was ordinary, and Delahance wept at her instruments to see a number behave like a number again. In the town the small unmakings reversed one by one, The baker Sepha Ord came to the record house on the 9th day to tell Oren that her loaves held a count again, 42, steady, and would not waver no matter how long she stared. The woman with the uncertain ring found it solid on her finger, and stayed solid, and she wore it out into the square, and held up her hand, so the whole town could see a thing that had decided, finally, to be real. The Cooper Bell opened his own door 100 times that day, the colony heard, just to watch it open on his own front room, and nothing else, on the ordinary world, on the place his house actually was. The 31 clocks of Teller's Reach, one by one, came back into agreement, and at the top of the 9th hour of the 9th day, every clock in the town struck the same hour, at the same moment, for the first time in 9 days. And the whole colony heard it, and a sound went up from the square that Oren would never be able to describe and never forget. The Ever account came out of the gray on the 10th day, with all 840 of its crew, because Marshal Caro had refused to let the gray keep even one, and it came out the way it had gone in, slow and dark and unbeautiful, and absolutely unbent. The colony watched the oldest hull in the 91st Bastion Fleet rise out of the retreating gray into clean straight light, and the gray fell away behind it, and kept falling away, west and west, collapsing back into itself, the unmaking unmade, until the western horizon was only a horizon again, ordinary wheat under an ordinary sky, and the second moon, Little Sol, hung where a moon should hang, round and whole and exactly where it belonged. The 6 came out too. That was the part no one had dared to ask for. As the gray collapsed, it gave back the survey cutter, whole, 6 people inside it, frayed and strange and not quite able to say what 9 days inside the unmaking had been, but alive, and named, and witnessed, and home. Mira Sol, the young pilot, was carried into the square, and the first thing she said, the colony reported, the very first thing, was her own name, out loud, the way she had answered it from the gray 100 times. Oren Vask, in the record house, took his pen, and beside the 6 names he had refused for 10 days to cross out, he wrote a single word. Returned. He signed it. It was the best thing he ever wrote, and he knew it the moment the ink dried. Marshal Caro came down to the square one last time before the fleet moved on, because the deep was wide, and there were a dozen unwritings known, and the 91st Bastion Fleet did not get to rest. The old marshal stood in the square where the names were still being read, because the colony had decided, then and forever, that it would never stop reading them, and looked at Petra Goss, and at Della Hans, and at Oren Vask with his inked hand. You asked for one ship, Caro said. We do not send one ship, we never have. When a small world asks for help against the unmaking, we send the fleet, the whole fleet, because the unmaking feeds on doubt, and the one thing we will never give it is a small answer. The marshal looked at Oren. You kept the books. You read the names. You held a line nobody trained you to hold, for 6 days, before we even arrived, with nothing but a pen and a refusal to give up your own. The Ever account held because you had already shown it how. Remember that, archivist. Write it down. We did not save you. You saved you. We only came to be sure of it with you, in great enough number that the gray could not argue. Then the 91st Bastion Fleet rose off the world in its hundreds, and turned toward the deep, and was gone. And Teller's Reach was alone again, under a sky that was a sky, with 19,041 living, and 206 dead, and 6 returned, and a habit, kept ever after, of reading the names aloud at the top of every hour. Before the fleet left, Marshal Caro did one more thing, and Oren recorded it as the last entry of the war. The marshal walked into the record house, alone, and asked to see the books. Oren brought out the great ledgers, the originals, the ones in his own hand. The 6 names never crossed out, and now marked returned. And Caro turned the pages slowly, with an old careful hand, and read them, all of them, the births and the harvests and the deaths and the small witness things, the pot and the glaze, the couple who loved each other, the 11 houses that had flickered and held. When the marshal finished, the old eyes were wet, which Oren had not expected, and Caro said that in 91 years of carrying the fleet's number into the dark, across 4 unwritings and now a 5th, this was the first world that had been keeping the right kind of record before the fleet ever arrived. The first world that had understood, on its own, with no training and no warning, that a name written down is a name that cannot be erased. Caro said that the fleet would carry a copy of Oren's books from that day forward, in the core of the Ever account, beside the muster, as part of the certainty the oldest hull took into every gray it ever entered again. And so it was that the small ledgers of a quiet farming archivist became, by an old marshal's order, a permanent weapon of the 91st Bastion Fleet, read into the heart of every unwriting humanity would ever fight, forever after, because a colony had been brave enough to write its own existence down before anyone came to save it. The years went by, and they were ordinary years, which was the whole of the gift. The grain grew. The children whose ages had been inked on their arms grew up, and had children of their own, and inked no ages on anyone, because there was no need, and that too was the gift. Petra Goss governed 4 more years, and then died old, and was buried with her name read out by the whole town, and Della Hance ran her observatory until her hands could no longer hold the instruments. The Cooper Bell told the story of his door, until he was very old, and the baker's grandchildren ran the same oven, 42 loaves, never miscounted. And Oren Vask kept the books. He kept them for 31 more years, every name born and every name died, in his own neat hand, and he never once crossed out a name he did not have to, and he taught the keeping to those who came after him, and the reading never stopped. The colony built one thing in those years, and it built it before it built anything else, before the new mill or the new schools, or the wide stone road, because the town agreed without a vote that it had to come first. It built a hall for the reading, a long plain building of pale stone at the center of the square, and on its walls, carved deep so that no glaze could thin and no edge could fray, were the names. All of them. The 19,041 who had lived through the gray, the 206 dead, the 6 who had been lost and come back, carved a little larger than the rest, with the word returned beneath them, and in a place of its own, by the door where every soul who entered would pass it, the muster of the Ever account, all 840, the names of the strangers who had taken the oldest hull into the worst place there is, and not bent. The reading moved into that hall and never left it, and the bell still rang at the top of every hour, and there was never an hour, day or night, in all the years that followed, when at least one voice was not reading the names aloud beneath the carved walls. Children learned to read by reading them. The old came to read them when they could no longer farm. It became the one thing that was always true of Teller's Reach, the thing a traveler heard before they saw the town, a voice on the wind reading names, and people said you could feel it the moment you crossed into the valley, a kind of settledness, a sense that here, at least, the universe was very sure of what was real. He was old when the Second Fleet came. 81 years old, his hands spotted and slow, the word still inked on the back of it every morning, out of a habit he had kept for 40 years. The colony was 40,000 strong now, grown into a real world, and one evening, the sky filled with hard, clean lights again, ranked and ordered, and an old fear that had never fully left woke in the oldest hearts in the town. But it was not the gray, it was the fleet, passing on its way to somewhere deeper, and a voice came onto the speakers, a younger voice than Oren remembered, clear and steady in the way that voice had always been steady. Teller's Reach, it said. This is the Marshal of the 91st Bastion Fleet. A pause. My records say this is the first one, the first world we ever held against an unwriting, the first one they ever saved. The young Marshal's voice changed, just slightly, the way a voice changes when it is standing on ground it knows is holy. Is that true? Is this the first one? And Teller's Reach answered, because Teller's Reach had been ready to answer that question for 40 years, and had been answering smaller versions of it every hour of every day since. The town answered with its speakers and its bells, and then with its voices, 40,000 of them, in the square and the lanes and the fields, the children and the old and the 6 who had come back and grown old too, all of them, at once, one word, and the one word was yes. Oren Vask heard it from the record house, the 40,000 voices saying yes into the sky, and he sat down at the long desk where he had sat for 40 years, and he opened the book to the last clean page, and he took up his pen one final time, because the gray had asked the universe a question 40 years ago, and he had never finished writing the answer, and he was an archivist, and an archivist finishes the record. He wrote it slowly, in the steady hand he had kept all his life, and it was the last thing he ever wrote. We asked for one ship, he wrote. They sent a fleet. It went into the place where the rules come apart, and it did not bend, because we read its names, and it read ours. And between us there was no doubt left for the gray to drink. You cannot erase what is witnessed. You cannot unwrite what is remembered. So we remember. We say the names. The living and the dead, and the 6 who came back. We have said them every hour for 40 years, and we will say them every hour for 40,000 more. This is the answer to the question you ask us. Gray, when you came to ask how sure we were that we exist. We are still here. We remember. Round up. He signed it. The way he had signed everything. Witnessed. The way he had signed 40 years of births and harvests and deaths, and the 6 who came back. And beneath the signature he wrote the date. The one number an archivist never leaves off. Because a thing without a date is a thing the Gray can argue did not happen on any day at all. Then he set down the pen, and his hand, the one with his own name inked on it that morning out of 40 years of habit, came to rest on the open page, and that was how they found him in the morning. The old archivist at his desk with his hand on the last record he ever kept. The answer finished, the books closed in peace, and outside the long stone hall the names went on being read, as they would be read for as long as there was a teller's reach to read them, which the town had decided, that day, would be forever. Out over the town, 40,000 voices were still saying yes, into a sky that was only a sky, and the bell at the top of the hour rang clear and true, and the reading of the names began again, the way it always began again, the way it would always begin again, and the oldest hull in the deep, somewhere far away, carried its 840 names through the dark, unbent, on its way to the next small world that would ask for one ship and be answered with everything. We are still here. We remember. Round up.